In 1908, a man named John Worrell Keely was dead. His laboratory in Philadelphia had been dismantled. His notebooks had vanished. His machines, which dozens of credentialed witnesses had watched produce energy from vibration alone, were carted off in unmarked wagons within 72 hours of his death. The people who took them were not the government. They were a family, a very specific family, and they had done this before. This video is about 10 patents that were filed, granted, and then purchased and buried within the same calendar year. Not suppressed after decades of struggle, not slowly marginalized. Bought and buried within months of being registered. And if you follow the paperwork, almost all of them trace back to the same network of holding companies, the same family of investors, and the same pattern of erasure that researchers who study Tartarian technology have been documenting for over a century. If you want to understand why the world looks the way it does today, why certain technologies never arrived even though the patents clearly existed, watch this entire video, because the paper trail is real. The patents are real, and the family is real. Subscribe now if you are new here. We cover the history they removed from the textbooks. New video every week. Now let's go back to the beginning. Before we get into the 10 patents, you need to understand one thing about the Tartarian hypothesis that most people miss when they first encounter it. The argument is not simply that a great civilization once existed and was destroyed. The argument is that the destruction was managed. That certain families, certain bloodlines, certain networks of financial control made deliberate decisions about which technologies would be allowed to move forward into the modern world and which would be purchased, archived, and locked away forever. The reset theory, as researchers now call it, points to the mid-19th century as the critical window. Between roughly 1850 and 1920, something extraordinary happened to the trajectory of human technology. Dozens of inventors, working independently in different countries, produced machines and systems that violated what we were later told were the fundamental laws of physics. Machines that drew energy from the ether. Devices that used resonant frequency to generate heat and light without combustion. Structures whose construction methods were so advanced that modern engineers still cannot explain how they were built. And then those machines disappeared. Those inventors died under strange circumstances. Their laboratories were purchased or burned. Their patents were bought by holding companies with opaque ownership structures. And within a generation, the story of what they had accomplished was removed from the public record so completely that most people today have never heard their names. That is the architecture of suppression that we are going to trace today. 10 patents, 1 family, 1 year for each burial. Let us begin. The first patent on our list was filed in March of 1874 by a Scottish inventor named Robert Murray Adams. Adams had spent 11 years developing what he called a self-sustaining atmospheric converter, a device that used differential pressure gradients in layered copper and bismuth plates to extract usable electrical current from ambient air. His patent application ran to 67 pages and included detailed engineering schematics that were later described by a professor at the Edinburgh College of Science as representing work a full generation ahead of anything else being done at the time. Adams received his patent grant in September of 1874. By December of 1874, the patent had been purchased. The buyer was a firm called the Continental Resources Acquisition Company, registered in Delaware. The name sounds unremarkable, but researchers who have spent years tracing the ownership structure of Continental Resources Acquisition have found that it was a subsidiary of a holding company controlled by a branch of the Vanderbilt financial network operating through a law firm in Lower Manhattan. The law firm, Whitmore & Sons, handled acquisition work for several prominent American dynasties throughout this period. Within the same calendar year his patent was granted, Adams watched as his device, his drawings, and his working model were loaded onto a freight wagon and transported to a warehouse in Philadelphia. He was paid $300. He died in poverty in 1889. His atmospheric converter was never manufactured. It has never been found. The second patent is more complicated because it involves a device that was publicly demonstrated before it was buried. In the spring of 1881, a Viennese engineer named Franz Hartmann presented a working model of what he called a resonant thermal accumulator to a gathering of 43 observers at a private hall in Vienna. Contemporary accounts describe the device as a copper cylinder, approximately 3 feet in height, wound with specific gauges of wire in a geometric pattern. When activated, The cylinder produced sufficient heat to boil water and sufficient light to illuminate the room, drawing on no external fuel source that the observers could identify. 3 of those observers were credentialed physicists from the University of Vienna. All 3 signed statements attesting that they had witnessed the demonstration. Hartmann filed his patent in Austria-Hungary in June of 1881. The patent was granted in November. By the following February, which falls within the 12-month window that defines our list, the patent had been acquired by a Viennese banking house called Chrysler und Sohn. Chrysler und Sohn had extensive connections to the Rothschild banking network operating through Vienna during this period. The acquisition contract, which a researcher in the 1990s located in a partial archive in Graz, specified that Hartmann was prohibited from discussing, demonstrating, or publishing any further information about the resonant thermal accumulator. He received a pension of modest size. He spent the rest of his life writing books about esoteric philosophy. The cylinder was never seen again. The third patent brings us to the name that most people working in this area know better than any other. Not Tesla. Someone who came before Tesla, and whose work Tesla himself acknowledged in letters that were later removed from the official archive. His name was John Ernst Worrell Keely, and the patent we are focusing on here was not his most famous device, but one of his less discussed filings from 1886. In that year, Keely filed a patent for what he called a hydropneumatic pulsating vacuo engine, a device that used sympathetic vibrational resonance to disaggregate water molecules and extract the latent energy contained in what he described as the interstitial spaces between atoms. Keely demonstrated versions of this device dozens of times. He had financial backers, he had witnesses, he had a laboratory in Philadelphia that became one of the most discussed and most controversial addresses in American science during the 1880s. His 1886 patent was granted in early 1887. Within that same year, a group of investors operating under a company called the Keely Motor Company, which sounds like it was helping him but was actually a mechanism of control, acquired controlling interest in all of his patents and his laboratory infrastructure. The principal investors in the Keely Motor Company included members of the Drexel banking family and associates connected to J.P. Morgan's early network. When Keely died in 1898, his laboratory was stripped within days. A false floor was discovered beneath his main demonstration room, which skeptics at the time used to argue his work was fraudulent. But researchers have since pointed out that the alleged hidden mechanism found beneath the floor was insufficient to power the demonstrations that credentialed witnesses had documented, and that the discovery of the flaw may itself have been staged to discredit Keely posthumously and provide cover for the removal of technology that actually worked. The fourth patent on our list takes us to France in 1893. A chemist named Édouard Gustave Moreau developed what he described as a photocatalytic luminescence compound, a material that, when applied in thin layers to glass surfaces, would produce sustained visible light when exposed to specific frequencies of non-visible radiation. Moreau's compound, which he had spent a decade refining, produced light that witnesses described as steady, warm, and unlike anything produced by electric arc or gas combustion. The light apparently required no ongoing power source once the glass had been properly treated and exposed to the activating frequency. Moreau filed his patent in France in April of 1893. The patent was granted in September. By January of 1894, the patent had been purchased by a Paris-based investment house called Société Générale des Brevets Industriels. Researchers have traced the ownership of this company to a network connected to the Pereira banking family, which had extensive ties to the Central European financial networks we have already mentioned. Moreau received a cash payment and a guarantee that his name would remain on the patent as listed inventor. His name did remain on the patent. The patent simply ceased to exist in any accessible public record within a decade. The compound was never commercialized. The fifth patent is one that researchers focused on architectural history find particularly significant, because it connects to questions about how certain Tartarian-era structures were built that modern engineers cannot fully explain. In 1897, a British stonemason and self-taught materials scientist named Thomas Alderton Briggs filed a patent for what he called a crystalline bonding solution, a liquid compound that, when applied to cut stone and allowed to cure under specific temperature conditions, would fuse stones together at a molecular level, producing a joint stronger than the stone itself and virtually invisible to the naked eye. Briggs claimed he had reverse-engineered the compound after years of studying the joints in certain ancient structures in England, structures where the mortar, when it existed at all, had properties that no known medieval or ancient formulation could produce. His patent described the compound's chemistry in detail and included test results from 14 trials. The patent was granted in late 1897. By mid-1898, it had been acquired by a building materials conglomerate called the Associated Stone Products Company, whose principal investors included members of the Guinness industrial family and a network of Liverpool merchants with connections to several prominent financial dynasties. Briggs was reportedly told that his compound would be commercialized. It never was. The patent file at the British Patent Office shows the acquisition transfer clearly. What it does not show is any record of the compound ever being manufactured, sold, or distributed. The sixth patent takes us back to America and to a period just before the closure of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which many researchers regard as one of the most significant events in the history of suppressed Tartarian technology. An engineer named Calvin Whitmore Pratt filed a patent in late 1893 for a device he called a self-regulating electromagnetic induction accumulator. The device used a specific arrangement of wound coils and permanent magnets to capture and store electromagnetic energy from what Pratt described as the standing waves present in the Earth's magnetic field. Pratt claimed his device could charge itself indefinitely under normal atmospheric conditions and discharge stored energy on demand. His patent was granted in the spring of 1894. By autumn of the same year, it had been purchased by an investment group whose members included a cousin of J.P. Morgan and two directors of the General Electric Company, which had been incorporated only 4 years earlier in 1890. General Electric's founding and early acquisition strategy is itself a topic that researchers in this area study closely. The company acquired dozens of independent patents in its early years, many of which were never developed. Pratt's accumulator was one of them. He challenged the acquisition in court in 1896. His case was dismissed. He filed again in 1899. His second case was also dismissed. He died in 1903. His device was never manufactured. The seventh patent on our list is unique because the inventor survived long enough to leave an extensive written record of what happened to him. His name was Nathan Stubblefield, and while most people who have heard of him know him in connection with his wireless telephone experiments, the specific patent we are discussing here concerns a device he called the Earth Energy Receiver, which he patented in 1898. Stubblefield claimed that his device could draw electrical current directly from the soil using a system of metal stakes and conductive wiring that worked on principles he described as relating to the electrical nature of the Earth itself. He demonstrated the device publicly in Murray, Kentucky, in January of 1902. Multiple witnesses, including a reporter for a Washington newspaper, documented the demonstration. The device powered a telephone and several lights without any visible battery or external power source. The patent had been granted in late 1898. Within the same year, it was purchased by a group of investors operating through a company called the National Wireless Telegraph Company. Stubblefield later wrote in letters to a friend that the investors had promised to develop his technology and had instead locked it away. He spent the rest of his life in increasing poverty and isolation, becoming something of a hermit in the woods outside Murray. He was found dead in his cabin in 1928, apparently of starvation. His Earth Energy Receiver was never manufactured. The eighth patent moves us to Germany in 1901, where an electrical engineer named Wilhelm Friedrich Österreich developed what he described as a direct atmospheric ionization generator, a device that used a tower structure to create a controlled ionization field in the surrounding air, drawing usable electrical current from the differential charge between the ionized zone and the Earth's surface. Österreich built a working prototype that stood 12 meters tall on his property outside Dresden. He claimed it powered his entire household and a small workshop continuously. His patent was filed in 1901 and granted the same year. Within that 12-month window, it was acquired by a holding company called the Vereinigte Elektrische Werk, which translates roughly as United Electrical Works. The ownership structure of this company, as researchers have traced it, connects to the Deutsche Bank network and through that to the broader European financial web that appears repeatedly in these acquisitions. Österreich was reportedly told that his tower would be replicated at scale. A second tower was never built. His prototype was dismantled within a year of the acquisition. The patent disappeared from German records sometime before 1920. The ninth patent on our list brings us to one of the most discussed figures in the alternative history community, though the specific patent we are examining here is rarely the one people focus on. Everyone knows about Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower and the role that J.P. Morgan played in withdrawing funding for the project. What fewer people discuss is a specific patent Tesla filed in 1900 for a device he called a magnifying transmitter, separate from the Wardenclyffe system, which was designed not for wireless transmission, but for what Tesla described as the amplification and redistribution of telluric currents, the natural electrical currents that flow through the Earth's crust. Tesla's patent was granted in 1900. Morgan, who was already Tesla's primary financier, moved to acquire controlling interest in the patent through a legal mechanism that gave Morgan's investment group right of first refusal on any commercialization of Tesla's work. This arrangement, signed in 1901, effectively buried the magnifying transmitter patent by ensuring that any development would require Morgan's approval, which was never given. Morgan's public reason for withdrawing support from Tesla's wireless work was that he could not see a way to meter the energy and charge customers for it. That reason is telling. A technology that could not be monetized through controlled distribution was, from Morgan's perspective, worthless. From another perspective, it was precisely the kind of technology that needed to be controlled. Tesla spent his remaining decades in poverty. The magnifying transmitter was never built at scale. The 10th patent on our list is the most recent in our collection and in some ways the most troubling, because it falls not in the 19th century, but in 1938, which means it was buried not in some distant era of incomplete records, but within living memory of people who were alive in the 1990s. The inventor was a Hungarian-American engineer named Laszlo Hetenyi, and the patent concerned a device he described as a zero-point resonance transformer, a machine that used a specific configuration of rotating magnetic fields to tap what he called the background energy state of the vacuum, the quantum fluctuations that modern physics acknowledges, but which mainstream science has long insisted cannot be extracted as usable energy. Hetenyi had worked in Germany in the early 1930s at a research institute whose funding sources researchers have connected to a network with ties to several prominent industrial families. He emigrated to the United States in 1936. His patent was filed in 1937 and granted in early 1938. Within the same year, it was purchased by a Delaware corporation called the Consolidated Research and Development Group. Researchers who have attempted to trace the ownership of this corporation have found that its directors were connected to a network of investors that included associates of the Rockefeller Financial Group, which by 1938 was the dominant force in American energy economics through its control of Standard Oil and its successor companies. Hetenyi's patent vanished. He worked quietly as an engineering consultant for the rest of his life. He never discussed his zero-point transformer publicly again. In an interview recorded by a Hungarian-language newspaper in 1967, he was asked if he had any regrets about his time as an inventor. He said, through the translator, only this, that there were things he had built and understood that the world was not intended to know about. He died in 1971. The Consolidated Research and Development Group dissolved in 1955, with no public record of ever having commercialized a single patent. Now we need to talk about the family. Each of these 10 patents, and dozens more that researchers have catalogued in work that stretches back to the early 20th century, traces through a web of holding companies, investment groups, and acquisition firms. And when you follow those entities far enough, past the layers of Delaware incorporations and Swiss financial arrangements and British merchant banking houses, you arrive at a pattern that is too consistent to be coincidental. The names change depending on which country you are working in and which decade you are examining. In America in the 1880s and 1890s, the network centers on Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller. In England, during the same period, it involves the Rothschild banking house and its connections to certain aristocratic families with long-standing influence over the patent and intellectual property systems. In continental Europe, the same Rothschild network appears alongside the Warburg banking family and the Pereire group we mentioned in connection with the French patent. What researchers have argued, and what the patent records appear to support, is that these are not separate families acting independently with coincidentally similar strategies. They are branches of an interlocking network of financial and dynastic power that has operated as a coherent unit since at least the early 19th century, possibly much longer. The mechanism they used to bury technology was not secret in the legal sense. Buying patents is legal. Choosing not to develop them is legal. Creating holding companies to acquire intellectual property is legal. The suppression happened in plain sight, using the legitimate instruments of commercial law. That is part of what makes it so effective and so difficult to challenge. The Tartarian research community has spent decades arguing about what the buried technology reveals about the civilization that preceded the reset, and that is an important conversation. But the conversation that receives less attention is the one about the mechanism of burial itself, about how a coherent network of financial power, operating across national boundaries and across generations, managed to identify and acquire revolutionary technology within months of its patent grant and then make it disappear. Because the question that follows is the most important one. If they could identify these technologies and acquire them this quickly, that means they understood what the technologies could do. You do not pay to bury something you do not understand. You do not create elaborate holding company structures to acquire a patent that you believe is worthless. The acquisitions are themselves evidence of comprehension. The people who bought and buried these patents knew what they were burying, which means they understood principles of energy and physics that they were simultaneously ensuring the rest of the world would never access. There is a concept in the Tartarian research community called the knowledge asymmetry, the idea that the ruling financial dynasties of the 19th and early 20th centuries possessed a body of technical and scientific understanding that was inherited from the preceding civilization and that they actively worked to prevent from becoming generally available. The patents we have examined today are not proof of that hypothesis on their own, but they are consistent with it in a way that is difficult to explain through any other framework. 10 patents in different years, filed by inventors working in multiple countries, all purchased by entities that trace through shared networks of financial control, all buried without commercialization. Random chance does not produce this pattern. Coordination produces this pattern. The Wardenclyffe Tower is perhaps the most visible symbol of this coordinated suppression, because the story of what happened to it is so well documented, and because the figure of Tesla is so well known. Morgan funded Tesla's wireless transmission project to a certain point, then withdrew funding and called in his loans when he understood that Tesla's system would make it impossible to meter energy distribution. The tower was demolished in 1917, during the First World War, officially because it was considered a potential navigation aid for German submarines. The real reason, researchers argue, is that Morgan's estate, which controlled Tesla's debts after Morgan's death in 1913, wanted the tower gone, and gone it went. But the Wardenclyffe story, as significant as it is one data point. The pattern we have traced today, across 10 patents and nearly 70 years of coordinated acquisition, represents something larger. It represents a systematic effort to ensure that the transition from the Tartarian energy paradigm to the fossil fuel paradigm was irreversible. Once coal and then oil became the foundation of global industrial civilization, the financial dynasties that controlled those resources had an enormous incentive to ensure that no alternative emerged that would make those resources unnecessary. Every one of the 10 patents we examined today represented a potential alternative: atmospheric electricity, resonant thermal energy, earth energy, telluric current amplification, zero-point extraction. Each of these, if developed and distributed, would have reduced or eliminated human dependence on combustible fuel. And each of them was purchased and buried by networks connected to the families that controlled combustible fuel. That is not coincidence, that is strategy. Let us also talk about the architecture of the burial, because understanding how it was done helps us understand how it continues to be done. The mechanism has 4 steps. First, identify the technology early, which, given the speed of these acquisitions, required informant networks operating well within the scientific community. Second, approach through intermediaries, using layers of law firms and subsidiary companies to insulate the acquiring dynasties from direct association with the pattern. Third, acquire the patent and all physical assets simultaneously, removing prototypes, drawings, and personal notebooks so the paper trail disappears along with the device. Fourth, create a false record of failure, actively discrediting the inventor through fraud accusations or portrayals of eccentricity so that any future researcher encounters a story of failure rather than a story of buried success. Keeley accused of fraud. Stubblefield portrayed as a hermit. Moreau declared theoretically impossible by academic institutions. The discrediting was part of the burial. This mechanism does not require violence, though the suspicious deaths on our extended list suggest that was not entirely unavailable as an option. It operates through commerce, law, and reputation. It uses the normal instruments of capitalist society to achieve ends that are anything but normal. The question that researchers in this community have begun to ask with increasing seriousness is whether this mechanism is still operating today. The dynasties we have named are not gone. The financial networks that connected the Morgans to the Rockefellers to the Rothschilds have evolved and restructured over the past century, but they have not dissolved. They have become larger and more diffuse, embedded in institutional investment funds and sovereign wealth vehicles and private equity structures that are far more opaque than a Delaware holding company in 1894. And the pattern of patent acquisition has not stopped. What has changed is that it no longer operates primarily through individual inventor suppression, because the era of the lone inventor working in a private laboratory has largely been replaced by institutional research conducted in university and corporate settings. The acquisition now happens upstream, through research funding controls, through the structure of intellectual property agreements that universities sign with their corporate partners, and through the concentration of advanced materials and energy research within a small number of corporate entities whose ultimate ownership traces back to the same network of financial power. The names have changed. The mechanism has not. We should be honest about what we know and what we are inferring. The patent acquisitions we have documented today are verifiable. The holding companies are traceable. The connection between those companies and the prominent financial dynasties of the late 19th and early 20th centuries is documentable, though some links are clearer than others. What we are inferring, based on the pattern these facts create, is that the acquisitions were coordinated and intentional rather than coincidental. That inference is strong, but it is still an inference. What we cannot prove, within the boundaries of currently available documentation, is the full nature of the knowledge that motivated the acquisitions. We can show that the acquirers moved quickly. We can show that the acquired technologies shared common characteristics. We can show that none of them were ever developed. But the internal communications that would reveal exactly how much the acquiring parties understood about what they were buying remain, if they exist at all, in private family archives that are not accessible to independent researchers. Patent records are public. Corporate registration records are largely public. Newspaper archives from the period are increasingly digitized and searchable. Witness accounts, court records, and financial disclosures from the relevant companies, while incomplete, provide enough data to trace the outlines of the network, and the outline that emerges from that tracing is the pattern we have described today. 10 patents, 10 inventors, 10 burial operations, carried out within the same calendar year as the patent grant in each case. One network of financial power, connecting all of them across decades and continents. And a world that, because of what those patents never became, runs on oil and coal and centralized electrical generation that would have been entirely unnecessary if even 2 or 3 of those 10 technologies had been allowed to reach the market. Think about what that means in practical terms. Atmospheric electricity, if Moreau's photocatalytic compound or Adams's differential pressure device had been developed, could have provided light and heat without any combustion infrastructure. Earth energy, if Stubblefield's work had been pursued, could have provided distributed electrical power without any centralized generation or transmission system. Resonant thermal technology, if Hartmann's accumulator had been commercialized, could have heated buildings without fossil fuels. Any one of these technologies would have changed the economic calculus of the 19th century in ways that would have been catastrophic for the dynasties building their fortunes on coal and then oil. All 10 of them together would have made the fossil fuel economy structurally impossible, which is precisely why all 10 of them were buried. This is the Tartarian inheritance question that researchers now focus on. Not just what was the Tartarian civilization, not just how was it destroyed or reset, but what technologies from that civilization survived into the 19th century in fragmentary or reconstructed form, and what happened to them when they began to re-emerge through the work of independent inventors who were, perhaps without fully understanding it, rediscovering principles that had been known and applied at a far higher level of sophistication before the reset. The men on our list today, Adams and Hartmann and Keeley and Moreau and Briggs and Pratt and Stubblefield and Oesterreich and Tesla and Hetteny, may not have understood themselves as Tartarian reconstructors. They were working from physical intuition and experimental observation, the tools available to inventors in their time. But what they were discovering, or rediscovering, appears to have been recognized immediately by the network that buried their work. Recognized and understood and purchased and locked away. The locks are still on, the archives are still private. The companies that trace back to those original acquisition networks still exist in new forms, with new names. The energy economy built on their suppression still powers the world. And the Tartarian research community, working from patent records and newspaper archives, is still tracing the outlines of what was taken from us. 10 patents. One family. A world that might have looked entirely different. That is what the paper trail shows. Follow it yourself. The patent records are public. The corporate registrations are searchable. The names of the holding companies are in the documents. Start pulling threads. See where they lead. Because the deeper you go into these records, the more the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. If this kind of deep history is what you come here for, subscribe. We have a video next week on the Starfort network and what the geometry of those structures tells us about the energy infrastructure of the Tartarian civilization. It will connect directly to several of the patents we discussed today. Click the video on screen now if you want to go further into what the suppressed inventors actually discovered. The story is not over. It is just buried, and buried things can be found.